Good morning, everyone. My name is Marc Idelson, and I'm going to be your guest lecturer this morning. So today I thought we'd look at how leading from home is different from leading in usual circumstances. And this is part of a series which started 2 weeks ago. And it's the first time I'm introducing the SECI model. So please feel free to ask any questions regarding anything I introduced today at the end of this session. So first of all, I'm going to use the perspective I usually use in my research, that while others see organizations as flows of money or nexuses of contracts or they look at organizations by looking at their assets. I'm essentially look at organizations as vessels of knowledge, sometimes well shared, sometimes poorly shared. So the first thing I have to introduce here is the fact that leaders have to organize the knowledge flows in their organizations. And sometimes that means plotting how knowledge should flow. Sometimes it means wrangling the way knowledge actually flows. And often it means sparking new knowledge to flow, because that is a source of innovation, which leaders have to spark. So, first of all, organizational knowledge exists in two dimensions. There's explicit knowledge, sometimes called codified knowledge or formal knowledge, and tacit knowledge. And knowledge exists at the individual level, in both ways, at the group level, and at higher levels, including boundary spanning knowledge. So it flows up and down and across between explicit and tacit knowledge. So you'll, for example, here at a team level, we have explicit knowledge creating more explicit knowledge. At the organizational level, we can have tacit knowledge creating inter-organizational tacit knowledge, and so on and so forth. And so what Professor Nanaka introduced from psychology 2.5 decades ago, is the SECI model. And the SECI stands for socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. And essentially, he identified that when you create knowledge from tacit knowledge that is also tacit, that's a specific process, and he coined the term socialization for it. When you create knowledge that is explicit from tacit knowledge, that is externalization. When you create explicit knowledge from explicit knowledge, that is combination. And finally, when you create tacit knowledge from explicit knowledge, that is internalization. And here are a few examples, which are boundary spanning or not. So let's start with socialization. So socialization is typically what happens when a master-apprentice, in master-apprentice situations. So this is situated learning. This is sometimes called OJT, on-the-job training. And I'm sure you all have circumstances where that occurs. For example, when you have a plumbing apprentice joining a new construction site. For the first few days, he may not do much more than observe. And after having observed for a while, maybe a senior plumber will give him a small task to do to see how it goes and so on. So let's move on to combination. So combination is the realm of Cartesian thinking, the realm of logical deductive reasoning. So here, for instance, we could take any literature review in academia. So a research paper, basically summing up and combining existing research papers. Research papers are essentially explicit knowledge, they're published. And so combining them into a further paper is also, by construction, explicit knowledge from explicit knowledge. Externalization is what happens when you formalize tacit knowledge. So, for example, imagine that you are in a plant and you start documenting what people are actually doing versus what the manuals says that perhaps they should be doing. Well, by jotting down and typing up the observations, you are creating explicit knowledge from tacit knowledge, and so you are doing externalization, form of knowledge creation. And finally, internalization is when you do the opposite. So, for example, if you are in a class, let's say a mathematics class, or you're reading a textbook, and after the theory is introduced by the professor or the textbook author, you decide to apply it by doing exercises. And so you are internalizing the theory to put it into practice. So anyone leading an organization needs to be mindful of the knowledge flows and the type of knowledge created, because the circumstances under which socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization occur are distinct. And so you need to organize your structure to enable all of them to occur. And that is also true for the spaces in which these forms of knowledge creation flow. So what does that mean? Well, essentially it means that you have also 4 kinds of spaces that you need to engineer, to design in order for the knowledge creation to occur in under all 4 processes. So for socialization, you need the originating ba. And ba is just a Japanese word to mean situation, space. Even in theater, it's actually the word for act. So a series of connected scenes. So it's just a simple word to coin the space where learning occurs. Externalization needs interacting ba to occur. Exercising ba will cover internalization objectives, and finally cyber ba will cover combination knowledge creation processes. So originating ba is where existential issues will be addressed. Reflective issues will be addressed by the interacting ba, systemic issues by the cyber ba, and finally synthetic issues by the exercising ba. So here are a few further definitions of this. So the originating ba is the place where individuals share feelings, emotions, experiences, and mental models. So this is the place where sympathy and empathy for others emerges. There should be no barrier between me, us, and them, others in this space. This is what Heidegger calls being thrown into the world. So, in other words, this is like throwing your child into the swimming pool to help him learn to swim. This is what a Japanese executive called, when designing such a space, engaging with customers, as gapless co-experiencing. This is where knowledge and vision are acquired by new hires. So by socialization, the understanding of the mental model behind the activities of a team, of an organization, will be indwelled into each new hire. And so the key success factor to realize these kinds of spaces is willful openness. So it means open organizational design, open customer interfaces that facilitate direct encounters between individuals. The second space, interacting bar, is a spot where people meet and think together. So this is typical of project teams, task forces, cross-functional teams. So here you need essentially the internal mental models are shared out, compared, and a form of mediation can occur in order to converge on common concepts and terms of reference. So this is a more consciously constructed space than the originating bar. And typical key success factors are on the local project level, how you staff the project in question, and at the organizational level, the institutionalization of these collective reflections, so that they are carried and enacted by the core culture and values of the organization in question. The third space is cyberbar. This is where collective Cartesian thinking thrives. So essentially, this is already virtual, whether it's paper-based or IT-driven. This is where you find all of the setups with knowledge management systems, groupware systems, online collaborative networks. This is where you find solutions that are can be bare bones text-based discussion forums, all the way to rich media-based systems. And so here, in order for these to succeed, and there is a lot of literature on failed KM projects, what you need to do is make certain that for every business cycle, whether it's an annual, seasonal business cycle or a project life cycle, you have your brief, you have your debrief, and in the debrief, you have to have allocated the time and resources to produce lessons learned in the team, but also to share those lessons more widely. So if you don't allocate budget, resources, and promote this through the right incentives, it is possible that your knowledge management system will not take off. And finally, we have the internalization space. So this is where people meet and act. So whereas the interacting bar was where people learned by thinking and by expressing internal mental models. Here, it's learning by doing. And so here is where we have on-the-job training, as I said before, focused teaching from senior mentors or colleagues, active learning by continuous self-refinement, and exercises stressing certain patterns and allowing the trainees to appropriate these patterns and continuously repeating them until they're second nature. And the key success factor here is the mentor selection, of course. So to lead is also to craft and stage knowledge flow baths. So to lead from home is to craft and stage the virtual versions of these baths. So what does this mean in practice? Well, as far as the socialization space, the originating bar is concerned, well, you have to rethink some of the leadership tools that are already practiced. So I've just taken one example. There's a tool that I think was coined in the 70s called Managing by Wandering Around. Sometimes it's called Managing by Walking Around. And this is a typical leadership tool to enable leaders to feel the pulse of their organization by randomly walking around the factory floor, the office building, not in a pre-programmed visit, of course, because then everything is prepared to show what the middle management wants to show to the leader, but engaging with a line worker, a first line manager, even a customer to get another source of grasp of what's going on in their organization, because middle management will tend to report things through a certain lens, and it's always a good idea to triangulate that data with other sources of data to have a proper understanding of what's going on in your organization, and that's what helps you build a vision based on evidence and not just on your perception of what's going on. So here we have to contextualize NBWA to the lockdown situation. And so I don't know what the new term will be. Will it be managing by zooming around, or just managing by wandering around from home? But you need to do the same kind of impromptu visits to Zoom meetings and to show that as a leader you're connected to all your staff, and so you need to find ways to do this from home. As far as the externalization space is concerned, tools sparking directed creativity are at play here. So typically, you have brainstorming sessions, sometimes with a compare or a brainstorming host, sometimes not. And so the typical tools you find here are whiteboards, exercises where people write down issues and then independently, and then these issues are confronted. And so this is typically important when you're faced with wicked problems, so problems that cannot be sliced down into sub-problems for which you find sub-solutions. And then with the sub-solutions assembled, you have the solution for the whole problem. But where the sub-solutions are too interconnected or the sub-problems are too interconnected for any sub-solution to be independently emerging just from slicing the larger problem. So typical wicked problems include climate change, include issues where the people framing the problem are part of the problem. So there's a difference between, say, addressing issues of different understandings of a problem from different disciplines, and issues that are purely resolved by logic. So online tools already combine some of these features, such as shared electronic whiteboards, but it will take a lot of practice and probably a lot of listening too, because the tools for remote communication, whether video or audio, are not something we're completely attuned yet. This is a cultural change for all of business activity. So we need to as leaders, we need to hone our listening skills and make sure that a silence in a meeting is noted, detected, and the reason for someone not saying something might be more important than the people who are saying something. Next, we have combination. So combination is already virtual. So there is really nothing to do, and this has been true already for many activities for decades, if not centuries. If you take the formation of the insurance industry back in the time of colonial Britain, essentially this was the intent was to pool risks along shipping lines, and so this was a purely virtual exercise of accounting and pooling of risk. Risk is a virtual concept, and so we have some long-lasting virtual constructs in our mental models today. Money could be argued to be another one, and more recently, the financial conglomerates that emerged after World War II, such as ITT, put into place financial controlling of units independent of their business activity, and this is also something that is virtualized. Essentially, anything explicit is something that you can whittle down to text or numbers, and so anything that a spreadsheet can carry is virtual, and anything that can't be put into a spreadsheet is what is missing from explicit knowledge. So there's nothing to address for the combination space. Cyberbomb. I'm sorry about the omission here in the slide. And finally, we have the exercising bar for internalization. And this requires, of course, to be on site. So if your activity requires you to move matter, or to be near a piece of hardware, whether it's an industrial site or simply a lab with expensive equipment, then there's not much you can do than go on site to do on-the-job training, and so that includes, of course, all the activities that are currently under duress, under in some cases very severe forms of stress, but you still need to carry out on-the-job training. Life must go on, and so teaching hospitals have to continue to have interns. Factory floors have to if there is turnover, if there's demand for their products today, they need to continue to hire people and organize on-the-job training for them, of course, with new health and safety legislations, and of course, anything logistic may also need some mentoring if it cannot be done remotely. So planning the routes can be done virtually, but actually carrying, transporting matter will still need to be done in the physical world. For some activities, tools video communication tools like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Skype, and so on will suffice. But in other cases, you will need more immersive virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality solutions, such as Verbella or Spatial. And I've seen online, but I don't have time to illustrate this morning. I've seen how these can be implemented fairly easily. There's now some very elegant solutions to organize immersive spaces where people can design together, say, a new car and so on, and it's quite clear that the standard video communication tools will not be enough in some cases. And there we go. So, as always, listening will prove key. So, in conclusion, the takeaways from today are that knowledge is dual, both tacit and explicit. It flows up and down within and between organizations. Organizations can and their leaders can engineer spaces to become the organic ground of knowledge creation, so that it facilitates the four kinds of transfer and conversion of knowledge. Leading is already virtual in a great sense, whether from home or not. Real spaces have tacit practices and explicit principles that can themselves be recontextualized, transcribed, translated, and reinterpreted for their virtual counterparts, the virtual spaces. And voila, that's my opening lecture for today. And next week, I'll follow up on last week's lecture by looking at knowledge building from the point of view of Chinese and Western philosophers. And this will be a complement, of course, to the ethical stances I talked about last week. So now we can open for questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français si vous préférez. Okay, well, if there are no questions, thank you. Hold on. So the question is, quelle est la place de l'intelligence émotionnelle? So I'm going to answer in French. Well, emotional intelligence is very much present in socialization and in externalization. Essentially, this is about tapping into tacit knowledge, and emotions are clearly tacit in nature. You can also find it in internalization, in the sense that mentors have to be attuned to detect the emotional, they have to have the emotional intelligence to understand what's going through their mentees, their trainees during on-the-job training, for example. So if I go back to the slide question here. So in originating situations, sympathy and empathy are expressions of emotional intelligence. Clearly, in social, or the originating bar that you find in typical office spaces would be the water cooler area or the coffee machine area, where people socialize. So this is open designs to engage without any necessarily very directed productive objective. In interacting bar, it's important to especially if you're tasked in your project to go to tackle a wicked problem. It's important to have people who, or at least a moderator, who is able to feel the pulse of all the stakeholders around the table. When you're doing mediation, it's important to listen to every stakeholder's point of view before thinking of a solution, because if you start anticipating and designing a solution before you listen to everyone, the people who haven't been listened to are saying, oh, so you have a solution before you listen to me, so why should I contribute to this brainstorming and so on. So that's important to be emotionally intelligent in that context. And finally, in the exercising bar, as I've mentioned before, it's important to for the mentor to sense the mentee's state of mind and make sure that they're not at risk of stress or burnout because too much is asked for them in on-the-job training. So, second question, comment faire le diagnostic d'une équipe? So how to diagnose a team? Okay, so I'm not sure what that means exactly, but let's put it this way. I'll answer this in the context of a team leader leading from home. So naturally, everyone being under lockdown is creating stress. And so it's important to detect stress within a team and to diagnose it before it erupts into burnout and contagion. Because if someone burns out in a team, there's a likelihood that others will burn out too. And if the whole team burns out, there might even be a knock-on effect. And this might spread to other teams in a cascade fashion, not unlike a physical virus, of course. So in other words, mental health, mental well-being should be the concern of any leader leading under lockdown. So how to detect it? Well, it's important once again to listen. If say two members in a team meeting start to openly conflict, I think what I would do as a leader is perhaps pause the meeting, take the two individuals aside individually, understand what's going on, try and impress on them the point of view of the other side, and so on. And then once they're calmed down and so on, get back to the meeting. Another situation you may find is that you, within a team, you have cliques that have formed, which means that you have two or three sub teams in open conflict. In that case, you, instead of interviewing them individually, after you've identified the cliques, interview them separately, but one clique at a time. And there might be people in the team who aren't part of this internal conflict, but you can also interview them to have an outsider's point of view of what the cliques are all about, and so on. And if the situation has escalated to that, you can also ask yourself what your responsibility as a leader is for having let this conflict fester, although that's sometimes unavoidable in some circumstances. And finally, if you have a team where everyone is in conflict with everyone without necessarily there being cliques, I would say that the first duty there is to isolate that team from the rest of the organization to prevent contagion beyond. And once you've isolated it, then you can tackle it and diffuse demind the situation. So the main diagnostic tool, as always in management and leadership, is communication skills and listening first and expressing yourself second. So then we have a third question, which is, does collective intelligence embrace all the SECI processes? So I would say that they can't not embrace them in the sense of that they practice them. Now, whether a specific collective intelligence effort does this knowingly or without self-knowledge about it is another question. Typically, the reflective space is the interacting va. So, and when we talk about collective intelligence, we're essentially talking about collective knowledge. So we're at the knowledge rungs above the individual in the ontological dimension of knowledge. So when hopefully, if you have an engineering of collective intelligence, which means building common visions, building common worldviews, enabling collective decision making, they should be both aware of the context, the tacit knowledge they have, and the formal knowledge they have. And of course, I cannot imagine a collective intelligence project where there is no tacit knowledge at play. And conversely, I can't imagine one where there is no explicit knowledge at play, although I guess there can be situations where there is very little collective knowledge. For example, take a good soccer team. It's mostly tacit knowledge, and a soccer team with collective intelligence can outperform a soccer team with individual intelligence that is poorly coordinated, and we see that every day in sports competitions. So I would say that yes, SECI is clearly embraced implicitly, Whether this is articulated explicitly is another matter. I'm certain that some aspects are addressed, but although the SECI model has been the dominating model in knowledge management research since the mid-90s, that doesn't mean that everyone who practices managerial skills is explicitly aware of it. I of course apply it in my practice, whether it's in research, in teaching, in training, and in these webinars, as much as I can. It's hard to do an exercise when it's more of a transmission than an actual exchange, interactive course. But clearly, that would be ideal to be aware, whether articulated under SECI or under another acronym doesn't matter, as long as there's awareness of these 4 types of knowledge creation. And I should add that they're not new. Tacit and explicit knowledge have a long-standing subject of debate in philosophy since antiquity. And tacit and explicit knowledge were introduced to the field of psychology in the 50s by Polanyi. And so it took centuries for psychology to introduce epistemology, applied epistemology to their field. But once again, it's a new field from the 20th century. And management is a newer field in many respects. And it took 30 years for this dual articulation of knowledge to go from psychology to management. So here we are today. Okay, well, thank you all. And I hope, oh, hang on. I have a final question. I'll assume it's a final question. Can you give an example of a time for a cycle of the SECI model process within a company? Well, I'm not sure I understand so it's not, so the SECI model is not a circular model. It's not about you start at one place and you go through all 4 processes of transfer and conversion. It's about 4 types of knowledge creation, because you have 2 types of knowledge, and you have type of original knowledge and type of created knowledge. So what I hope I've done this morning, let's take that as an example, is that I have given you some explicit knowledge on SECI, and I hope that from this framework, you can start your own reflection on your own knowledge creation practice. So I hope that you will notice when you create new knowledge individually or as a team leader for your team, that you notice what kind of new know-how and new factual knowledge is created, and we'll go over knowledge building more next week. But essentially, anytime you create new practical skills for yourself, you're creating tacit knowledge, whether that practical skill is learning to analyze a spreadsheet or to design a new building. Some of these will be very small, some of these will take longer time. So if you look at your resume, every time you act professionally, you are acquiring new skills or deepening your existing skills. That's knowledge creation right there, of a tacit nature. So some of these you can pick up in a matter of minutes or hours. Others will take you months, even years, to hone, to be practice at it. And that's also true, of course, of explicit knowledge. If you read a newspaper, you will learn, it will transfer into you new facts, new vocabulary. But if you read a whole book, you might create in yourself new explicit knowledge of a more sophisticated nature, such as new theory. So there isn't a set time for knowledge creation. It can be short or long. I hope this helps, and I look forward to engaging with you next week. Everyone, have a nice day.